Welcome to my humble abode, darlings. Come in out of the rain and get comfortable. I have a story to tell you, and I hope you enjoy. If you do, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Salutations, my darlings. As you can hear, this illness is still taking its toll on my voice. Other than that, I feel great. Today, I'm bringing you a story from BearLair, and it is called Cryptid Invasion, Small Town Horror. Oh my gosh. Did you see that? Chanel shrieked into her boyfriend's ear. Aquarius, Q to his friends and acquaintances of dubious character and spelling skills, leaned away from her in annoyance, his ear all but ringing. "What's wrong with you, motherfucker? Girl, why you be hollering like that, Nellie?" Chanel pointed towards the window, a large one for a manufactured home built in the primitive era that had produced the one in which she and Q were currently ensconced. She trembled and shook and shrank closer to his form, as he grimaced and looked in turn. "Man, I don't see nothing. Just dark and dark." He frowned in distracted wonder for a moment. The Pine Shadows manufactured housing park facility and residence typically displayed a number of lights, primarily strings of LED and dim security bulbs, strung by the most decent but impoverished residents, for whom Q was the most frightening feature of their existence. Currently, the illumination seemed to be obscured, and as his blood returned to normal circulation, Q grew curious. A sickly yellow halo cast from the nearest pole light silhouetted something. He wasn't sure what it was, but realized why Chanel must have observed it and freaked. She was pretty high-strung or strung out. Whatever. His mouth hung open in the way that indicated his attempt to cogitate. It was an unaccustomed endeavor, so it took him a deal of effort. Besides which, he indulged in a few party favors to whet his appetite for what he thought Chanel was finally prepared to offer. Either way, he'd intended to have some fun. Now, he didn't know whether he had hallucinated or was mistaken. He was sure that it had to be the latter. What he saw, what he continued to see, could not be anything other than a mistake, an illusion cast by a combination of high emotions, impaired perceptions, and poor lighting. The blazing eye that shone, in profile the long face, the immense height, the steam or smoke that issued from its nostrils, like a werewolf from the movies, he finally concluded. Chanel continued to stare, then shrieked again. "It's staring at us! What the She trailed off her astute observation and continued to return the gaze of the thing. Then she saw its lips curl and revealed a row of teeth that were far too large for any creature known to her. For that matter, the beast's head rested high above where the normal person's profile would be. "Them teeth in that eye, it ain't right. It's like too big." Q, having figured out that what she saw was beyond the normal range of hallucinations, and having further concluded that any such unnatural monstrosity posed a danger, reached a conclusion on what he should do, his natural solution for the most vexing problems. He fished among his outerwear from earlier in the evening that was now piled untidily on the floor. He managed to find what he needed, his nerve, in the form of a .38 semi-automatic pistol, manufactured in some Eastern European nation, or former nation. He'd employed it often enough to shore up his failing courage, and when he carried it, He felt like a true gangsta. He raised the muzzle towards the window, yet even the dim bulb in his brain, far weaker than the outdoor lighting, flashed in warning that it would be stupid to blow out the glazing. When the door was just feet from the portal, I think it's a werewolf, he stammered as he moved to open the door. He pushed the panel outward, and it slammed against the side of the vulnerable housing option. He'd emptied the magazine of all 6 rounds he'd bothered to put into the little weapon. It would have held 2 more, but he knew that gun's supposed to hold 6. As he fired, the sharp little reports added to the cacophony of chaos caused by Nell's screech and shouts and various responses of neighbors. The tiny world of his and his erstwhile date transformed into an abode of terror. Chanel did her part. Her squeak screeches evolved into genuine screams of abject fear as she encouraged her latest paramour to kill it, Q! Kill it! Kill it! Kill it! LT, thanks for coming over so fast. RP, one of them, is a known felon and has open warrants, to include for assault on public servant and resisting arrest. So, based on the new policy, Sergeant Booth let her comment trail off into space. Lieutenant Hornbuckle knew the policy well, since he'd authored it, a fact neither unknown nor unappreciated by the sergeant. He grinned at her. Thank you, Sergeant. It was a good call on your part. We have informed him yet that after his first done with his witness statement, he's under arrest? Booth shook her head. No, sir. We thought it would sidetrack him. He's already not making much sense. We have an eye on some items in that trailer of his. Apparently he treated his latest girlfriend, to some of the finest homegrown. He must really like this one. Gave her some of his vintage night train, too. Oh, and he shot up his own front door with the handgun he's not allowed to possess as a felon. Poor old Q is not having a good night. And it's about to get worse. I think he's likely just having some paranoid side effects. He likes to lace his goodies, but never know with that dude. Hornbuckle grimaced. Q ensured that a couple of our deputies and one of the Grogan City officers had a bad night while he earned that warrant. Turnabout is fair play. Paranoid hallucinations or not, I'd like to hear the latest strange tale from him. So maybe we can get him to tell it once more. Then we'll have 2 recordings. Everybody's rolling on body cams? Booth arched an eyebrow. You know we know how to roll, boss. Let's go. I responded with Deputy Walls, so I got to hear the first version by Chanel. It's literally a wild story. Oddly close to what Q had to say. She smirked a little in anticipation of what her manager was about to hear, and wondered what his reaction would be. Priceless, she guessed. I tell you I ain't lying. It was a straight-up monkster. Like a movie or some pin, man. Like a movie or something, man, Q insisted when he saw the blank expression on Lieutenant Hornbuckle's face. After a moment, Hornbuckle shrugged. Nobody called you a liar, Q. It's just a weird tale. You say it looked like a werewolf, dude. Like a big-assed effing dog, but you know, on 2 legs like a dude. I shot that sumbitch and it disappeared. Can't find no blood or nothing, like it's some kind of ghost. Never seen nothing that big. He shook his head as if to clear the image. Hornbuckle nodded to Sergeant Booth, then turned to walk over to speak with Chanel. From behind he heard Q exclaim, Arrested for what? I'm already in handcuffs, man. Then something about a right to defend his home with his tiny pistol. It didn't matter. As far as the lieutenant was concerned, his story had been a paranoid fantasy. Then Chanel told him pretty much the same tale, And just as Sergeant Booth has indicated, it was reasonably consistent. So it was like a big dog head, way up tall. She stretched to her full height and reached as high as her arms would extend above her head. I ain't never seen nothing that big. It's like up in the fog, too. Like, it's making fog come out of its mouth. When I first seen it, he was like, looking the window at us. Big old face, big teeth, and them eyes. Like crazy demon eyes. I was like, no, gotta get out of here. Then Q shoots it to pieces, but nothing happened. Q, barely in earshot, was escorted past, screamed his outrage at the former object of his affection. What? You crazy bit! His threats were curtailed by strong hands that quickly subdued him and marched him to the back end of the transport unit. He glared over his shoulder. You so dumb, Nell. Why are you going to run your mouth? Janelle looked startled for a moment, then realized her mistake, attempting to correct the problem. Oh, like I was saying, somebody. Not Q. No way. He don't got no gun. Somebody shot at that thing. Ain't runs up into the woods on two legs, and I was just like, glad it be gone. After he'd thanked Chantel and turned her attention back to the deputies, who took her official statement, the lieutenant met again with Sergeant Booth. Candy, did anyone else in the park see this thing? She shrugged. I doubt it, but I'll send Deputy Morris and the canine around to ask. Maybe the dog can pick up a scent. Hornbuckle nodded. He knew that the patrol dog on their shift was a sight hunter, but if anyone or anything still lingered in the area, Ranger might pick up a scent. He was perplexed. The stories from the two sub-erudite witnesses had been very consistent. They'd clearly observed something. He heard a call on the radio to request that units respond to the inside-outside travel center for a disturbance. An intruder? Perhaps both. The dispatcher included that the caller had been nearly incoherent, and she was in the process of gathering more information. The truck stop, convenience store, was not far from the trailer park, and Hornbuckle made good time. While on the way, he phoned his boss, the chief deputy for the patrol division. Time to put some of the weight on other shoulders, he decided. It was early, but it felt like the beginning of a long shift. He had to leave a message. Chief, Ross Hornbuckle. Got some odd stuff happening. I'll have more details shortly. Just wanted to, that I'll be calling later with updates. Checking out the second scene is a possibly related incident. Unknown cause, but I'm feeling the vibe. Check you soon. He wouldn't normally bother his boss with something concrete, but he knew that the CD trusted him and would rather be in the loop than surprised. He briefly activated the emergency lights on his otherwise slick-top, unmarked vehicle to let the deputies on scene know he'd arrived. He saw two outlined forms investigating the backside of the building with flashlights. He approached them first. One called out to him, Hey, LT, Babin's inside talking with the store owner. Maybe the owner's brother or cousin? He wasn't all that clear. Thought we should look around and out here and while the scene was hot. Short version, he came out to empty the trash and something big came out of the woods. About 7 or 8 feet tall. Had a long snout. Said it was covered in hair and maybe spots of blood. Eyes glowed yellow-green. Made some weird noises and chased him back inside the store. Ross nodded. Any footprints? The deputies looked at one another sheepishly. Then the spokesperson replied, We haven't checked, yet, sir. It took only a moment to find a partial print in the little portion of moist dirt near the dumpster. Weird looking. Pretty big, the talker opined. Hornbuckle nodded. I'll go see if he has cameras that cover this area. Maybe we can catch the monster on camera. Maybe get a glimpse of bloody hide and yellow-green eyes. He soon found out that the camera covered the back door, but the owner didn't think it useful to waste recording time on the dumpsters. A shadow seemed to intrude over the image of Javid Patel, the reporting party. It was inconclusive since lights eliminated the object that created the shadows. From 2 angles so that the dark images were overlain, though it was definitely large. Javid was clearly in frame and clearly fleeing, or putting on a good show of it, and his shade was minuscule when compared to that of the monster. The interior camera angle showed him run to the office as soon as he'd slammed the door shut behind him. His father was the manager, but had been in the office during the encounter. I tell you, it was very big, very huge, tall as an elephant. It came from the dark, silent until I saw it. Then it blew out a loud, strange noise, and smoke blew into my face from high above. More than 2 meters, I tell you. It stank, worse than the dumpster, and it had matted fur all over. Very dark, with spots of blood, like it ate something alive and got splashed. I think it was a big feet or a forest demon. Javid told his story for the 5th time. Each telling had seemed to calm him, so Hornbuckle and Deputy Babin let him repeat it. The lieutenant instructed the deputy to take a formal statement, then returned to his unit. Before he could call in that he was about to clear the scene, a large figure loomed out of the dark. Hornbuckle, caught a little off guard, halted, and his hands hovered in a defensive posture above his waistline. The approaching figure, apparently even more startled, stumbled to a halt. Hey, sorry, officer. I drive that rig? He looked back over his rounded shoulder to indicate a tractor-trailer near the big truck filling station. So, I wasn't going to say anything, but I could tell that Jay, the guy in the store, was shook up. I was, too, so, look, this is going to sound crazy. He paused and rubbed the back of his thick neck. Ross gave him a reassuring nod. Can't be any worse than anything else I've heard tonight. Promise I won't give you a hard time. The trucker looked relieved. Thank you, sir. Look, I ain't drunk or anything. Got plenty of rest. It's just that what I saw, or think I saw, is pretty weird and scary and kind of hard to believe. I was on my way to the travel center, one of my regular fuel stops. That's how I know Jay. Anyway, on the way, I look over at the side of the road, and this thing, I don't know, some kind of creature, maybe a big old hairy man, but too big and not right, was standing at the side of the road, just inside some of the bushes. It was big, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. I pass stuff all the time, and you know, I'm a pro driver. I know how to judge distances and sizes. I catch some eye shine, maybe yellow, not sure. It was fast. It looks a little strange, and maybe, this is one of the weird parts. It had a huge set of antlers. Then it gets scary. Things starts running up on my passenger side. I'm in town, so I'm not going all that fast, but I check the mirror. It's running alongside and gaining on my cab. There's steam coming from it. I decide to swerve at it. I know I hit it. Left a dent at the rear part of my cab. I look back, and it's gone. Then not long after, I pay and start to pump. I hear weird noises from behind the store. Loud. And then Jay screaming, "It's gonna be all right, Jay." Jay. Loud. And then Jay screaming, "He's gonna be all right. Jay, I mean." There was more, and Hornbuckle sent to man to inside the store to see Babin and to provide a formal statement, and to get the photos of his cab for both evidence and insurance purposes. He was about to clear and conduct a patrol sweep, since most of his crew was tied up on the 2 invasion scenes. Then the radio hissed, and dispatch informed him that there had been another disturbance, this time with injuries, at a nearby set of rental cabins at the state park. He headed that way and pulled one of the units from the travel center and another from the trailer park for backup. The crazy is on, he said to himself. Spidey sense is still working. Austin, I'm telling you, there's something outside the cabin. Can't you hear that scraping along the walls? Francesca cautioned her cabin mate. Austin, ever the skeptic, and in this case, uninterested in venturing outdoors in the dark, started to protest when he heard the unmistakable sound of a hard, sharp object dragged across the outside boards of the little rental cabin. The place was not all that solid, and the walls were only 3/4 cut timber facade, not true logs, so the sound was quite audible. He nodded. Okay, probably just some animal, maybe a dog or something, he offered. Francesca was having none of his excuses this time. You hear how high up it is? Besides, unless a dog has an iron garden rake, it can't make those sounds. Let's get the flashlights and pepper spray and go see what it is. Austin stared at her for a moment, then found a last-minute stall. First, we should call the local police. Get some help headed this way. We don't need those redneck fascists. That's why we took this break from the city, to get away from all the law and order, and maybe being caught on camera without our masks at the last protest. Francesca shook her head. Don't worry, big guy. I'll protect you. With that, she triumphantly raised her device with the flashlight widget activated and her keychain pepper spray as she lumbered past her scrawny companion. Austin shrugged. I have the same kind of light, but I don't have any spray. I used it up when that group of pigs tried to move us from in front of their station. He glanced around the room. Ah, a final desperate prevarication technique. Oh, I can take my knife. You have a knife? Like a big hunting? Francesca quieted, when Austin triumphantly hefted his own means of defense. A 2-bladed, folding utility knife with rounded tips for safety. She shrugged. Okay, let's go. I'll turn on the porch light, and then we spring out and yell at whoever or whatever it is to go away. EMS arrived first. They'd been hovering in the area after all the weird dispatch calls. The crew knew that it was only a matter of time before someone was screaming and bleeding. Soon a pair of frightened and unhappy campers were under immediate emergency care. Lieutenant Hornbuckle saw that the large female figure who loomed on the tiny porch of the cabin stared sourly at him and his deputies as they approached. The woman demanded to know, So, what are those fascists doing here? Like, I only told dispatch that we wanted an ambulance, no cops. Hornbuckle stepped up to take care of the challenging work, or handling the recalcitrant RP, while the deputies conducted a safety sweep of the gloomy cabin and its environs, in which a monster may be lurking much more pleasant than dealing with hostility towards uniforms. He grimaced. Standard procedure, ma'am. We support our EMS teams as often as possible to ensure their safety as they go about their duties. She glared, her pock-marked and flabby expression, clearly interested in creating a conflict, but a whimper from her companion, followed by an, "Ow, that hurts," interrupted her normally single-minded train of thought. She had only one track on her personal railway. It was either full steam ahead or stay quiet and seethe. She shifted her ire-filled gaze towards Austin, who was clearly in distress. His face was flushed and covered in orange stains. He bled from several small cuts on his hands. Despite the thunderclouds of hostility that consistently threatened, Hornbuckle and one of the deputies managed to get a coherent statement from each of the couple by way of the EMTs. The medics often assisted in this way. It helped them to keep their subjects distracted with answering questions and provided them with potentially useful treatment information. Essentially, the two had charged out into the little porch, and Francesca had immediately tripped and fallen on the single stair that led down from the porch. Austin managed to stay on his feet, but stood indecisively waving around his pocket knife. They reported that about that time, the cryptid arrived. Hornbuckle liked it better than the monster. Fewer negative connotations and possibly less panic-inducing. It was like gigantic, and I was like, no way. Austin continued his narrative. So I see this thing stick out its head way up high, and it was just a skull with some antlers. Then Franny yells at it and sprays all over the place. Don't know why that worked, but it did. Sounded like it sneezed or something and then ran off into the trees. Deputy Tucker nodded along in an active listening technique. So it was very tall with a long skull for a face and antlers? Austin bobbed his head on his thin neck. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll never forget that face. All white and bony. He shivered, and Deputy Tucker adjusted his stance in case Austin finally decided to vomit his most recent meal. Austin, tell them how you got hurt again. I don't think the Gestapo here believe you, Francesca all but shrieked. Austin was startled out of his imminent need to hurl his victuals and started to bob and wobble his head once again. Francesca sprayed the thing in the face, but I'm between her and it, so I turned towards her and blocked the pepper spray with my face. I screamed, and the Wendigo, or whatever you call these things, bellowed and bumped into me from behind. I fall to one side, and that's how my hands get all cut and scraped. And that's when I sneezed or snorted, whatever. He shivered again. I thought it would get me, but then it ran away. Francesca decided to rejoin the chorus at the moment and pushed aside her long, straight, greasy locks. Yeah, it was face to face with that cryptidish thing, and it blows some kind of smoke at me. So I emptied the can into the skull face with the green eyes. It bellows again and vanishes. Nothing left but the smelly smoke, like it had rolled in garbage or something. Hey, Chief, thanks for the call back. Hornbuckle spoke wearily into his mobile device. Turned out the last RP had only minor injuries. Treated and released on the scene. I had Tucker stick around to make sure that they were safe until they got their stuff packed and moved on down the road. So far, we've had a werewolf, some kind of big feet, a forest giant from the woods that chased a rig like a dog chasing a car, and now some other giant, but with antlers and a skull for a face. Some of the crew said that these are all cryptids, another name for old-time monsters or boogers. Enough consistency to know that something or someone is terrorizing people and getting pretty beat up in the process. If it's the same thing, it's been shot, hit by a truck, and pepper sprayed. If it's different cryptids or human creeps, then at least we have 3 injuries. Regular invasion. Maybe we can catch up to them. He paused while dispatch relayed the next incident. Okay, Chief, I'll keep you in the loop. 1 or more of our cryptid invaders has made an appearance at the No-Tell Motel over near the bypass for the interstate. A few injuries reported, at least one major. Too close to be coincidental. Before he could leave, Tucker ran over, waving his arms. "Hey, LT, got something else." He halted outside the driver's side of the door, and Hornbuckle looked up inquiringly. "Mr. Yang, the guy that owns the cabins, said that he was busy earlier with someone who reported seeing a cryptid. It wasn't long before the incident here with Austin and Francesca. Seems some tent camper decided to go into the brush to pop a squat. Something big chased him and he ran into the trees. Got himself a broken ankle and a bad abrasion on one eye. Yang said that his wife and the guy's partner drove him to the hospital. I'll get on it. I heard dispatch call. Yang said the guy was pretty freaked." Ross nodded. "Thanks, Tucker. I'll touch base with you as soon as I know what's happened at the no-tell motel." Always something with that place. He made his way over the couple of miles to the bypass in the wake of the EMS unit. Sergeant Booth was on scene, for which he was relieved, and some of the deputies who had been assigned to earlier incidents had clearly cleared and come this way. A group of 5 individuals sat beside one of the patrol cars, with a couple of deputies speaking with them, and in one case attempting first aid. Another subject lay stretched on the ground near the cement sidewalk that fronted the rooms on the lower floor of the structure. Booth and another deputy knelt by this one. Though he couldn't tell what they were doing, the EMS crew rushed to the supine subject. Booth moved to allow them to treat him or her. Ross wasn't close enough to determine which yet. Booth noted him approaching and walked over to greet him. "Hey, boss. Long time no see." She bobbed her head. She always seemed to be happiest when they had a crazy night. And this one certainly qualified. She flicked her thumb over her shoulder. That one came off the upstairs rail the hard way. Definitely a broken collarbone. Maybe arm. You may notice a certain chemical stench in the air." Hornbuckle nodded. "Oh, de meth and booze." Booth nodded. "Bingo. Oddly, no other party favors located just yet. We've been busy with that group." She inclined her head towards the figures, seated along the patrol vehicle. "I can't understand why, but it looks like nobody ran. Chick came off that rail one way or another, and the rest ran inside the room and just waited. All started either mumbling or shouting about that big effer thing they saw. We're still trying to figure out what it was. Night manager Akbar, of course, saw nothing. He was locked in the booth behind the night window. Said this bunch came in after dark a few days ago. Been loud and rowdy ever since, but nobody complains. Not in this neighborhood." Hornbuckle nodded. "Look at the map on these incidents. It's like some crazy near pattern. Almost like the incidents are in a big circle. Like something is trying to get out but keeps running into people." He pulled up a map on his mobile device to show her what he meant. Booth traced the rough circle with her eyes while Hornbuckle gazed around the parking area to determine what they'd missed. "Yep, that's a pattern," Booth eventually pronounced. "Not quite a circle, though. Big opening on one side." She pointed to the bypass, where a patch of forest separated it from the interstate. Hornbuckle looked up and nodded. "You got this one, Sarge? For once I'd like to be there before the call." Booth pretended to sigh, then pronounced, "Of course. Why would I want to go anywhere else? Just read the sign." She pointed to the backlit plastic rectangle that proclaimed that visitors of the no-tell motel could drive right up to the door of your luxury suite. Cody awakened to a slow, heavy tread of footsteps that entered the little camping spot he and Sophie, his latest conquest, had chosen for their quiet rendezvous. He loved the outdoors, but the park was too crowded this time of year. And nobody lived on this old stretch of country road 287B besides Mr. Wesson, who had a little farm ranch at the end. It had once been on the other end of the road before the highway department ruthlessly placed the interstate to one side of the little town. Cody was old enough to recall visits to Mr. Wesson's place when he was in first grade. The man kept several exotic pets, to include a llama, an emu, a pair of elk, a moose, and several others. Locals would bring their kids out to get photos with the strange menagerie and hear tall tales from Manfred Wesson's extensive repertoire of stories. The mud and gravel country road was lined with trees, and when the interstate cut through it, the Wesson place had been on a continuous stretch. His property line had fallen short of the land the state purchased, and he was cut off from his neighbors who dwelt on the other side. The town side, the part of County Road 287B, had been renamed Crossover Lane and led back towards the other side of Grogan City. This little clearing had become his favorite place to set up a tent and erect a small fire. He knew and liked the elderly man at the end of the road. He'd even helped with some chores in exchange for silence about the location of his campsite. He used it to entice the girls in the area to experience his nature boy charm. Sophie lay wrapped in the blanket he'd provided, clearly fast asleep and snoring lightly. Exhausted by the lumberjack of love, he chuckled inwardly. The night was pretty dark, and he'd listened intently, concerned that someone may have tracked down his little hideaway. The fire outside had burned low, but there was enough light that it created odd shadows on the tent wall. Odd but familiar. The same kabuki theater of tree limbs and twisted branches that had been there when he had last awakened. He sat up slowly and quietly. Definitely somebody sneaking around the camp, he decided. He quietly reached for the pants he'd hastily discarded earlier in the night. The belt on them held the sheath for his knife. It was as impressive as he thought himself to be. The silhouette appeared at the front of the tent. The jawline was way too long to Cody's thinking. He began to shake. He knew that the trees had cast their shades along the nylon wall, reached a certain height, and that this thing outside the thin wall had to be enormous. It let out a weird, whiny grunt, and steam or smoke was briefly outlined against the feeble light from the dying blaze outside. Cody knew his blade would be useless against anyone or anything so large. He glanced at the still, snoozing Sophia and realized they would both soon be torn to shreds and maybe eaten. The shadow puppet's outline darkened as a new source of light emanated from behind it. The head rose impossibly high. Then a bellow snort, like nothing Cody had ever heard, erupted from the beast. It sprang into the darkness and crashed through the trees for a moment. Then all went silent. The light was from headlights. Cody was so relieved that he didn't care who had found him. Maybe it was Old Man Wesson. He unzipped the tent door and found himself face to face with 2 county deputies. He was still gripping the knife, and they both drew sidearms and told him to stop. Hornbuckle contacted Deputy Walls and asked him to meet him on the county road that cut diagonally through the trees and towards the yellow lights of the interstate that glowed in the distance, like a ribbon through the darkness. Walls was clear and apparently eager to assist. He'd been left on patrol while the rest were tied up on scenes, so the lieutenant knew he was probably anxious to get back on that cryptid invasion. The biggest set of calls the county had received in many years, in volume if not in intensity. They met up and the 2 units crept down CR 287B. The lieutenant in his slick top took the lead. He hadn't been out this way for an even longer time than the rest of the crew, but he knew the general layout and that Mr. Wesson was the only remaining inhabitant. When he saw the trail that led off to one side and was clearly made by recent and regular small vehicle traffic, probably 4-wheelers, he knew they had at least paused to take a look. in case their subject or subjects had taken a detour and put others in harm's way. As he slowed to examine the fresh tracks on the muddied grass, he noted the yellow-orange glow of a campfire not far down the trail. He activated his alley light and shone it towards the campfire, and Walls did the same, but with more intense sidelight on his overhead bar. Both sheriff's office employees emerged from their vehicles with flashlights and weapons drawn and carried in the Sul position, gripped against the waist, barrel slightly extended so that any intentional fire rounds would strike in front of their toes. A hideous sound of rage emerged from the camp area, and brush began to crash and break in the wake of a very large body, or bodies. They rushed forward and encountered Cody, half-naked, knife drawn, breathing heavily, and with a wild look on his features. The rugged man dropped his blade on command, and a head with tousled locks emerged from the tent and blearily inquired as to the nature of the disturbance. It didn't take long to determine that Sophie was age 17, about half Cody's age. They searched Cody and secured him in handcuffs in the rear of Wall's vehicle. During the process, Hornbuckle instructed any clear units to come and assist. He intended to forge ahead after the cryptids. He wasn't foolish enough to follow the trail of trampled brush into the utter darkness beneath the trees. He stalked back to his cruiser and proceeded down the way to Weston property. He hoped he could head them off before it or they tangled with the elderly man. They'd get pretty torn up in the encounter. Mr. Wesson was a nice gentleman, as anyone would want to meet. But he was also tough as hickory root, and armed to the teeth. He was surrounded by his animals, mostly hunting dogs these days. The interstate had left his exotic pet zoo isolated. Hornbuckle determined that things were coming to a head, and it was time to stop the madness. Manfred Wesson peered into the darkness from his front porch. He didn't bother with lights. They'd only silhouette his form. He'd heard the racing car engines and saw the set of lights flashing in the near distance. Someone was headed towards him in a hurry. The hounds remained silent or issued low, throaty growls. He knew that was out of character. Typically when people approached, at least one or two would bay and bark. Besides, they weren't focused on the driveway that led up to CR 287B. They were pointing towards the woods to one side. They rambled around nervously and began to back away from the patch of trees as a new set of sounds impinged on Mr. Wesson and his dog's senses, crashing brush and breaking limbs. Finally, the hounds broke and ran up onto the porch to encircle their two-legged alpha, at least from behind. The nonagerian alpha reached for his 12-gauge and clicked off the safety. Whatever emerged from the trees, he'd be ready. As Hornbuckle turned into the dirt driveway, he activated his red and blue lights and whooped the sirens a couple of times, then switched back to only headlights. It was a simple courtesy to let Mr. Wesson know who was coming. He held no doubt that man would be on the porch, armed and ready for his late-night visitor. Yet when he rolled to a stop, all he saw was milling hounds on the porch around the front door. His heart leapt with a jolt of adrenaline, a fear response on behalf of his favorite isolated resident, the most self-reliant person in the county. He stepped out of his vehicle and scanned the area with his flashlight. He reached back inside and activated the trunk switch. He soon held his patrol rifle at ready, light affixed and ready for action. He heard the far-distant wail of sirens. Backup would arrive soon. But time was of the essence. If the cryptid or cryptids managed to get over the freeway and into the town proper, it would mean a disaster. It was only a set of miracles that had saved anyone from death so far. He preferred to trust years of training and experience, combined with TMJ rounds from his rifle to ensure safety from the monsters. That's what they are to me. He noted the area where something large and organic had burst through from the direction of the camp he'd left a short time past. The ground was torn up with odd footprints. They were large and misshapen. Maybe from hooves? He nearly leapt out of his skin when he heard the soft tones of an elder call his name. "Ross? That you, son?" Mr. Wesson emerged from around the side of his house. He approached, and they shook hands. "What's all the whooping and flashing about?" Well, Mr. Wesson, we had some kind of creatures. Maybe more than one attack folks on this side of the freeway. I tracked the, let's just say, creature this far, trying to catch it before it gets to the interstate, or worse yet, over into the other side, in amongst the Grogan City neighborhoods. Have you seen anything? Looks like it came your way." Mr. Wesson stood silent for a moment, considering. "Ross, you remember my old moose Teddy? The one I named after Teddy Roosevelt because of his bull moose party?" Ross was puzzled about the abrupt change in subject, but knew that Mr. Wesson wasn't a frivolous man when it came to human safety. "Oh, yes, sir. You had plenty of strange beasts. Folks used to bring their kids just to take photos with the giant deer and other exotics." The elder smiled toothlessly and bobbed his head. "True, but I missed him when he died. Pleasant fellow, old Teddy. He was already getting old when they put in that fancy road." As he spoke, he turned and started to walk back the way he'd come, around the back of the house. Hornbuckle easily caught up to walk beside him. "I found out that not every moose is like old Teddy. Some are downright cranky and like to roam no matter how much good sense is put in front of 'em." Hornbuckle heard a calmer version of the bellow he'd heard in the woods, what seemed like hours in the past, but was indeed less than a half an hour past. It was followed by a snort and a slobbery moan. His light presented the wooden rail fence and a set of feet just behind the lowest rail. The legs extended upward, and the body and head rose well above his own substantial height. He noted some wounds and a broken antler. A little dried blood resided on one side of the poor beast's mouth. Mr. Weston reached up and very gently patted the enormous creature's neck in an apparently unwounded section. "I need to get the vet out here to examine him, all right. Maybe he won't be so quick to roam after tonight. Ross? Meet Bruce. Bruce the moose." So quoth this raven. That was a fun ending, and thank you to Michael Lockhart for allowing me to use it, and I hope you all have a great day and had a great Thanksgiving if you're in any said country for that. Bye-bye. Thank you for stopping by, my darlings. It means so much. I so enjoy telling these stories for you. And here are some of my marvelous supporters. Please, if you haven't subscribed, consider doing so. If you give this video a like, it would help me out ever so much. Thank you, and have a lovely, lovely day.